everyone thought this case was about what happened on set. But the documents tell a very different story. Newly released voice memos, emails, scripts, and raw footage are now public, and once you see them in full, the timeline completely changes. What was framed as unexpected behavior is shown to be discussed, planned, and approved long before filming ever began. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the entire narrative you thought you understood looks very different from the very first seconds of this story. The tone shifts because what we are hearing now is not speculation, not rumor, not commentary, but documented material released through official court filings. And that matters because context changes everything. What once sounded like chaos now reads like a pattern. And the opening voice memo sets the emotional baseline immediately. This is Blake Lively speaking candidly, openly, without pressure, without coercion, discussing her body, her schedule, her fears, her stress, her family, her marriage, and her professional choices. She is not guarded, she is not defensive. She is not hesitant. She speaks as someone who feels comfortable and safe enough to overshare. And that alone reframes the narrative, because this audio was not recorded during conflict. It was sent before disputes, before lawsuits, before public narratives hardened. She speaks about wanting more time to prepare, wanting to feel confident on camera, wanting to get back into shape after giving birth, wanting to be present for her children, wanting to avoid extended time away from her husband. And these are deeply human concerns, but they are also voluntary disclosures. And that distinction is critical, because later claims hinge on the idea that boundaries were crossed without consent, when in reality the relationship dynamic presented here shows proactive communication, personal openness, and collaborative scheduling requests. She is not responding, she is initiating. She is not reacting, she is requesting. She is not being guided, she is guiding. And as the memo unfolds, it becomes clear that the production was not pushing her body image, she was expressing it. The production was not demanding accelerated timelines, she was negotiating them. The production was not inserting personal topics, she was sharing them. And that matters because intent and agency are everything in legal and ethical analysis. And when you hear her explain why she wants the start date moved, why she is overwhelmed, why she is stressed, why she fears separation from her family, it is not framed as accusation. It is framed as vulnerability, and the accommodations that followed did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in response to these requests, and the record shows those requests were heard, respected, and acted upon, which undermines later claims of disregard or pressure, and instead suggests a working relationship that prioritized her comfort, even when it required costly adjustments and scheduling challenges. And this is not opinion, this is documented through emails, timelines, and corroborating communications that align with her own words at the times. The narrative progresses, the contrast between private communication and public claims becomes more pronounced, because when footage emerges from the set showing how scenes were discussed, choreographed, and mutually agreed upon, the tone again shifts. What is visible is not discomfort, but collaboration, not confusion, but planning, not surprise, but anticipation. The dance montage discussion shows active participation, shared humor, mutual clarification, and clear acknowledgement of what actions are coming next, including physical proximity and scripted moments. And this is important because the allegations later rely heavily on the claim of unexpected conduct. Yet the footage shows step-by-step communication, verbal confirmation, and consent-driven blocking, where nothing occurs spontaneously or without discussion. And even the now famous line that became controversial is contextualized by preceding dialogue, where scent and physical closeness are openly discussed, initiated by both parties, and framed within the creative requirement of portraying intimacy on screen, which is literally the job description for the scene. And when this is paired with script drafts that show escalating romantic intensity, approved, requested, and revised with input from Blake herself, the argument that intimacy was injected without consent collapses, because the record shows repeated calls from studio leadership requesting more heat, more maturity, more sensual realism to meet audience expectations and rating standards. And those notes are not subtle. They are explicit in their desire for adult tone, not juvenile banter. And those notes were acknowledged, welcomed, and acted upon. And when certain iconic lines were rejected, it was not because intimacy was inappropriate, but because of creative originality and legal considerations. And this matters because it shows the conflict was never about whether intimacy should exist, but how it should be executed and credited. And when later claims attempt to recast these creative debates as misconduct, they clash directly with the paper trail showing that these moments were discussed, planned, and revised collaboratively well before filming began. The pattern continues when examining scenes that were later described as improvised or unauthorized because the scripts themselves tell a different story. Multiple versions show no physical contact where contact was later alleged, And where kisses were later claimed to be planned, the drafts show none. And this discrepancy is significant because it reveals retroactive narrative reconstruction, rather than contemporaneous objection. And when deposition testimony attempts to frame scripted actions as personal violations, the text itself contradicts that framing by clearly outlining romantic tension, physical closeness, and emotional escalation as part of the narrative arc. And again, this is not conjecture. It is text on the page approved during development, and when one party is later portrayed as introducing inappropriate elements, the scripts show those elements existed from the start, with studio backing and actor input. And this is further complicated by the reality that the same individuals who later objected to these dynamics were the ones advocating for an R-rated tone, emphasizing adult themes and seeking heightened intimacy to satisfy audience expectations. And when you overlay that with communications expressing fear of separation from a spouse, pressure to coordinate family schedules, and emotional stress unrelated to on-set conduct, a clearer picture emerges, one where personal circumstances influenced perception and reaction rather than misconduct driving conflict. And this distinction is critical because it shifts the narrative from wrongdoing to misalignment and from abuse to breakdown in communication, amplified by hindsight and legal framing. Ultimately, what these documents reveal is not a singular incident, but a cumulative story of accommodation, collaboration, and contradiction, where early openness later becomes grounds for grievance, and where creative participation later becomes reframed as victimization. And none of this negates emotional experiences, but it does demand accountability to the record, because when claims are made, they must align with evidence, and here the evidence repeatedly shows that boundaries were discussed, expectations were clarified, and creative decisions were shared. And when tensions escalated, they did so in the context of scheduling pressure, creative differences, and personal strain, not coercion or exploitation. And this is why the court has signaled reluctance to treat creative process disputes as evidence of misconduct, because doing so would set a precedent that undermines artistic collaboration entirely. And what remains after removing sensational framing is a story about communication, choices, documentation, and how narratives evolve when relationships fracture under stress and public scrutiny. And the most important takeaway is that transparency cuts both ways, because when everything is documented, the truth does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the most consistent record. When all the emotion is stripped away and only the facts remain, this case becomes less about scandal and more about accountability to the record. The audio memos, the emails, the scripts, the footage, and the timelines all tell a consistent story of collaboration, accommodation, and consent-driven decision-making that does not invalidate feelings, but it does challenge claims that rely on selective memory rather than documentation. Creative projects are messy, relationships are complex, and stress can reshape perception. But courts rely on evidence, not reinterpretation. What matters here is not who felt uncomfortable later, but what was agreed upon then. And the record shows repeated communication, clear consent, and significant flexibility extended to meet personal needs. As more material becomes public, the narrative simplifies rather than explodes, because truth tends to do that. It does not need exaggeration, it just needs light. When you step back and look at everything laid out, from the voice memos to the emails to the scripts to the raw behind-the-scenes footage, a very different picture emerges than the one that has been circulating publicly for months. This is no longer a story built on interpretations or selective recollections. This is a story built on documents, timelines, and original materials that exist exactly as they were created at the time. And what those materials show is not chaos or misconduct, but a working relationship shaped by communication, negotiation, and repeated accommodation. The voice memo alone reframes the entire conversation, because it establishes who initiated discussions about body image, scheduling, personal stress, and family separation. That matters because agency matters when someone voluntarily shares fears, insecurities, and personal details, and those disclosures are met with flexibility and support. It becomes very difficult to later argue that the same environment was inherently unsafe or coercive, especially when no objections were raised at the time. What is striking is how consistently the record contradicts later characterizations. Scenes described as unexpected are shown to be choreographed. Moments framed as uncomfortable are preceded by discussion and agreement. Creative choices later criticized were previously advocated for in writing by the same people raising objections. And the scripts themselves tell a story that cannot be ignored because they show romantic tension, intimacy, and emotional escalation built into the narrative long before cameras rolled. This was not a sanitized project. It was intended to be mature, emotionally complex, and grounded in adult relationships. Studio notes confirm that expectation repeatedly asking for more depth, more realism, and more connection. That context is essential, because without it the story becomes distorted. And when context returns, clarity follows. This does not mean that feelings are invalid or that stress was not real. In fact, the materials show a person under immense pressure, balancing motherhood, career expectations, and public life at the same time. But pressure alone does not equal wrongdoing, and discomfort experienced later does not retroactively erase consent given earlier, especially when accommodations were made, schedules were adjusted, and entire projects were reshaped to meet those concerns. The timeline shows effort, not disregard, and cooperation, not conflict. And when courts evaluate these situations, they are not asked to weigh emotions against emotions, but claims against evidence. And here the evidence speaks clearly. What also becomes impossible to ignore is how narratives evolve once legal positioning begins. Words change, meaning silence becomes implication, and ordinary creative disagreements are reframed through a lens of accusation. But documentation does not evolve, it stays exactly as it was written. And that is why this case feels different as more information comes out, because instead of escalating the drama, it narrows it. Each new release removes ambiguity rather than adding it. Each file makes the story less sensational and more procedural. And that is not what you would expect if there were hidden bombshells waiting to surface. At its core, this is a cautionary story about how easily collaboration can be rewritten once trust breaks down, and how important contemporaneous records are in preserving truth. Creative industries rely on communication, vulnerability, and trust, but when those same elements are later weaponized, it changes how people engage going forward. That is why this case matters beyond the individuals involved, because it forces a larger conversation about boundaries, documentation, and accountability on all sides. In the end, what remains is not outrage, but clarity, not speculation, but structure, and not a scandal, but a record. And when viewers are given the full picture, rather than fragments, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. This was not a story hidden in shadows, it was documented in plain sight all along.